Greetings, mortals. Today, I badmouth D&D for having too many rules, and how they're actually limiting what you're able to achieve. And I provide an alternative. Welcome to Tabletop Sandbox, where we talk about all things TTRPG. I am the biggest bird, also known as Harrison Tarr. This book is 300 plus pages. This book is also more than 300 pages. This book is also over 300 pages. And supposedly, you need all of them to run your first game of D&D. Sure, they have the starter set, but, you know, if you're jumping in and you want to do things right, theoretically, you're supposed to have all of those books. And sure, there's the SRD, so it's not necessarily a question of money. But wouldn't you rather not have to read through all of that? Wouldn't you rather just play a game that you can learn in an afternoon or even an hour, and then run it for people who have never played it before without any worry of rules you're forgetting, or not knowing how to build a character correctly, or not knowing the appropriate spell to use in this specific circumstance? This game can help. With a rulebook coming in at precisely 20 pages, Cairn is an indie RPG by Yochai Gal, which is rules light. It's potentially classified as OSR, Old School Renaissance, or NSR, New School Revolution, but even the creator of the game himself has said that it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek idea. The NSR includes basically anything that you want it to. So how is it possible that there are about 1,000 pages of rules that you supposedly need to know for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and there are 20 pages that give you everything you need to start playing and keep playing for however long you want to in this book? Now, sure, there are supplemental materials for Cairn, but also there are supplemental materials for 5e, too. Not to mention all of the adventures for D&D. This is a rules-light game, and honestly, a lot of it is random tables in here, too, that lets you roll up a character in probably less than 5 minutes and get playing as soon as possible. I'm gonna go over a few of the philosophies and principles that are in Cairn that apply not just to this game, but also to OSR games and probably TTRPGs in general. To help you get a better understanding of what this game is actually like and how it can only be 20 pages long. This game is classless and levelless, which means that there is no XP track and there's no starting class that you pick when you play. You don't even start at 0 level and then take a class when you hit first. You just don't have a class. All of your capabilities, whether it be casting magic or swinging a sword, are determined by what you hold in your inventory. Everybody has 10 slots, 6 are a backpack and 4 are your chest, hands, and head, and what you hold in those slots on your character sheet determine what you can do, in combination with the not 6 but 3 core stats of strength, dexterity, and willpower. Now, this game assumes that the player characters are hardened adventurers who have left their career behind to come and adventure. And the setting the creator had in mind was a creepy, haunted forest. But really, there's nothing in here specific to a forest or a swamp, so you can run this in whatever setting you'd like. So like I said, characters are adventurers, and they may be powerful, but they are not immune to death. In fact, they're vulnerable to harm in its many forms. If something makes sense that it would be harmful or difficult for you, there's a good chance that it's gonna have that consequence on you. You don't get to roll for everything. If you do something that's going to get you hurt, you might just get hurt. One of the things that you'll hear over and over if you start looking into the OSR is that they have rulings, not rules. Now, what does that mean? Rules are a specific set of mechanics that you use to resolve a certain circumstance. D&D has specific rules for how high you can jump, specifically how many pounds you can carry, how many feet you can move in a round, how many things you can do on your turn, and classifications of those things as, oh no, that just counts as an object interaction, but no, this counts as a full action, but that one's only a bonus action. There are a whole bunch of classifications in D&D, specific rules for specific circumstances to help you know what to do in any given situation. But sometimes it feels like the designers at D&D forget that you, as a player, as a game master, actually do have a brain. 5th edition especially has been very gamified, bringing people who all they've known is video games growing up into TTRPGs by giving them a very similar experience, where everything is input, output, action, reaction, according to the rules. But that's not really where role-playing games are their strongest. Role-playing games are their strongest because there's the potential to do literally anything. It is not the game master or warden in Cairn's job to present a fully developed adventure with a set response for anything that the player characters do in that game. It is the role to be a referee, to look at the things that the player characters are doing or that they want to do and say, does it make sense that they'd be able to do that? Does it make sense that it would be successful, or does that require a roll? And then referee that. Make a ruling. Don't consult a specific rule on what's happening, but make a ruling based on what makes sense within that fiction that you are creating together. It is also the warden's job as a referee to be neutral. They're not favoring the monsters, nor are they favoring the players. And neutrality is definitely something that's difficult to achieve, especially for new game masters. If you're a mean person, then you might have this adversarial idea of what it's like to interact with your player characters and feel like it's your job to present them challenges that's going to be really difficult for them to beat. Or if you're an overly kind person, you might find yourself on the player's side, wanting them to win in a way that makes it so you don't play your monsters exactly the way that they would act in the fiction. Neutrality is a tough mark to hit, and obviously there's going to be biases both ways, but that is a goal that you should strive to achieve when running Cairn and maybe every TTRPG that you run. The rules of Cairn make a big point of valuing player choice and player knowledge when they're making choices. When a player character makes a choice and faces a consequence, it shouldn't be something that blindsides them. It should be something that is a consequence of their actions that was foreshadowed as a possibility by the warden before it happens. It's also the job of the player characters to clearly communicate their expectations of what they're trying to do so that the warden can make an informed decision about how the world or other characters react to what has just transpired. This kind of communication between the warden and the player characters makes it so that there's not so much immediate suspense. The warden is not keeping all sorts of secrets from the player characters and jumping out with them at the right moment. No, this is something much more collaborative than you might see a game of D&D 5e played. The player characters work together as a team, but also the GM is working with the player characters to build a cohesive story together. Something that Cairn expects that modern D&D culture doesn't necessarily is that you as a player character are expected to bring a character that fits into the world already. You're not bringing your rainbow-colored tiefling OC into a grimdark world of only humans. You as a player character are working together with the game master to tell, like I said, a cohesive story. That means finding a character that fits into the world and acts within it realistically and believably within the context. Speaking of rainbow-colored tieflings, Cairn is very specific. The warden should say no to things that are impossible or don't make sense. If there is something that a player character is attempting that there's no reasonable way for them to achieve, then the DM will say, no, you don't roll for it at an extra high DC. They just can't roll for it at all. It's okay to say no, and it's actually damaging to ask your players or allow your players to roll for something that you as the game master or warden don't think that they would feasibly be able to achieve. It breaks the verisimilitude of the world. Another big principle that you'll hear talked about in tandem with the OSR is emergent storytelling. That means that the warden is not preparing an entire adventure for them to run through with set plot points and key events. They are playing alongside the characters, developing the story from their own mind, but also from the players and through use of random tables, and figuring out what happens. They're not telling a story that they know how it's going to end, or that it's going to end one of 2 or 3 ways. That doesn't mean that this isn't fiction or narrative focused. In fact, with so few rules, it has to be what the characters are doing, not the big sweeping ideas of what's going on in the world or what's to come in the future. You can include those, but the focus should be an action-reaction between the player characters and the warden at the table, addressing what's happening right now. On to the rules. Like I said earlier, in Cairn there are only 3 core abilities: strength, dexterity, and willpower. And these are the scores that you will use to roll all of your saves. More on that later. Another major score is your HP. Now, this doesn't stand for health points or hit points in Cairn. It stands for hit protection. It doesn't represent your physical vitality. It represents your ability to avoid taking damage, which makes sense if you think about the way hit points work in most video games or TTRPGs. I have a whole video talking about how hit points are weird in D&D 5e that you can check out here. Hit protection is limited. Each character only starts by rolling 1d6 to determine their HP, and that only goes up when you take something called a scar and get a chance to roll again and take the better score. The main thing that determines what your player character is able to do in Cairn is your inventory. You have 10 slots, but that's not all there is to it. If you take something called a fatigue, that fills up 1 of your inventory slots. And a big thing to note is that every time you cast a spell, you take 1 fatigue. So if you're carrying around a spell book and you only have 1 extra slot of your inventory open, you can cast that spell once before you fill that up to 10. And filling your inventory all the way full is not great, because that means you have 0 hit protection. Everybody starts with some starting gear, and there's a couple pages just devoted to developing your player character. They have random names, surnames, backgrounds, character traits, and starter gear. And everybody gets to roll on this table along with some gimmies like torches or rations. There's a good list of equipment, gear and tools, armor and weapons, and there's a list of spell books that is numbered 1 through 100. So if the warden so chooses, they can randomize what spell book you find. A link to this PDF and where you can find it will be in the description below. Now, when it comes to using your core 3 stats of strength, dexterity, and willpower, there's not checks or attempts or actions. All there are to roll is saves. And it's a roll under system, which means that each time you roll a single d20 and you're trying to hit or get lower than your score in that stat. Natural 1s are always a success and natural 20s are always a failure, which is an interesting turn on its head thing. But it makes for easy math. You don't make a save every time you attempt something. If you try to do something and it makes sense that you'd reasonably be able to do it, the warden will just say, okay, you do that. But if you're going into a situation where it might be difficult to achieve or difficult to achieve without putting yourself into danger, you make a save. Now, healing is interesting because regaining your HP, your hit protection, comes quick and easy. In the example in the book, it just says, resting for a few minutes and having a drink of water restores lost HP, but it does leave the party exposed. That might seem broken or overpowered until you realize that you only have anywhere from 1 to 6 hit protection. Losing your hit protection isn't really damage. The true damage comes when you drop below 0 HP and you take strength damage. Taking any strength damage immediately puts you out of the fight, and if you don't get help soon, you will die. Regaining strength takes a bit more time and effort, usually resting in a town or an inn for a few days. But losing your hit protection and your strength is not the only things that can be negative impacts on your character. You can be deprived of something that you need, like food or sleep, and then you're unable to regain HP or one of your ability scores. If you are deprived of something for more than a day, you add 1 fatigue to your inventory. A fatigue takes up a slot in your inventory. And like I said, if you ever have 10 slots all the way full, then you effectively have 0 hit protection. You're overburdened. You may also receive fatigue by casting a spell or through other events in the fiction that your DM might describe. Have to run away from a chasing wyvern for 7 miles over a rocky landscape, you might be fatigued afterward. The way Cairn handles armor is that before calculating your damage to your hit protection, subtract your armor value from that damage you've received. Shields and similar armor provide a +1 to your armor score, but it does limit you in that no one can have more than 3 armor. Now, Cairn is very interesting when it comes to combat, which is obviously the most crunchy and important and talked about part of games like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. There's no numbers in this rules section, really at all. There's no initiative order. You have to roll a dexterity check to go before your enemies in every round of combat, and a round of combat is not a specific amount of time. It just says that it's around 10 seconds. There's no turn order, but everybody declares what they're going to attempt to do at the beginning of the round before rolling anything. Then the Warden decides whether or not they have to make a save for that action. You roll your weapon die, and then your enemy subtracts their armor from that, and then they take the damage that's remaining. If multiple attackers target one foe, then everybody rolls, but you only take the single highest die result on the weapon die. There's no advantage or disadvantage, but if you are fighting from a bad position, then your damage die is reduced to a d4. If you have an overwhelming advantage, then your damage die or your weapon die is increased to a d12. I like this because it still doesn't guarantee success, but it gives you a lot better chance of it. And you could, if you rolled a 12, succeed wildly. The last mechanic I want to touch on is scars, which is really cool. Whenever you are dropped to exactly 0 HP, but not below, you don't take any strength damage, but you have to roll on the scar table. You roll a d12 and take one of the effects. An example of one of these effects is hamstrung. You can barely move until you get serious help and rest. Pretty devastating, right? But here's the caveat. After you recover, roll 3d6. If the total is higher than your max dex, take the new result. These scars are negative consequences of receiving wounds, but they also give you the opportunity to increase your character's stats. Some are for dex, strength, willpower, some are for your hit protection. You get to roll again and take the new high result. Sometimes you only roll another 1d6, or sometimes you get to roll 2, depending on what you get on the scar chart. There's a very simple bestiary, and really it's an introduction to creating your own monsters. And then, at the end of the book, there is a list of 100 spells. Now, if you've ever taken a look at the spells in Dungeons & Dragons, you'll see that each of them have stats like duration and area and range. In Cairn, each spell is a single sentence description. An example of this is hover. An object hovers frictionless 2 feet above the ground. It can hold up to 1 humanoid. That's all it is. Doesn't give you any specifics, doesn't say, you couldn't push this person, they have to stay where they are. It doesn't say a specific pound limit. It says up to 1 humanoid. So it could be, based on your warden's discretion, something that weighs up to about the highest weight of a humanoid, or it could be, it can only lift a humanoid. These spells are open to interpretation, and a lot of that interpretation comes when players get interesting ideas in their heads and they present it to the Warden, asking, could I do this? And if your Warden is cool and a good game master, and it makes sense that you'd be able to do what you're asking to do, they will say yes, and you'll take a fatigue. Or perhaps you have to roll a save to cast that spell successfully. And then other than the character sheet, that's the entire book. I haven't read you every single word, but I've covered basically all of the important points. That's an entire game in 20 pages. Not 1,000, not even 320. It might be difficult for an entirely new game master to grab onto and run a game for their players, but if you see it done and you get a sense for how these things are supposed to work, I'm confident that anybody could pick this up and have a good time. Part of the thing I love about this book is that there are so many non-specific rules. A round is only about 10 seconds. A spell can be interpreted in hundreds of ways, potentially. The frankly bloated rules of D&D make it so that for most actions, there is only 2 outcomes, success or failure, and every single nuance of those actions is already decided by the rules. These extra rules actually stifle your creativity and what you are capable of as a character in this world. Whereas in Cairn, you are given a basic understanding of what you're allowed to do with your equipment, but most of it is up to you. What do you do with that sword? Do you just swing it once? Or do you use it to jam open the door? Or do you do a very involved sword dancing routine to intimidate your opponents? All of these things are valid, and anything that you could think of. The lack of rules actually gives you more options, more things to do. The more mechanics you have, the more limited it is how you're actually able to achieve your goals. If this kind of content is something that you find interesting and you want to hear me talk about more games that you could play as alternatives to Dungeons & Dragons, subscribe and leave a comment below. Thank you for watching, and I hope that I've convinced you that sometimes fewer rules can actually give you more options. If you hear or see of anyone claiming to be a bigger bird than me, cancel them. I'll wait. Good night, mortals.